A homeless man begs Clint Eastwood for just $1. But what happens next will leave you speechless. A single moment, a simple act of kindness, turns into something far bigger than anyone could have imagined. This isn't just a story about money. It's about fate, second chances, and a ripple effect that changed lives forever. Stay with us, because this story will make you see kindness in a way you never have before. The first few nights were the hardest. Sleeping on cold concrete, surrounded by strangers who had also lost everything, was not something Daniel ever imagined for himself. He remembered the days when he had warm food, a soft bed, and a television to watch. Now all he had was a dirty old jacket and a small bag with a few things. He felt invisible. People walked past him every day, never stopping to ask if he was okay. They avoided eye contact. They held their children close when they saw him. It was as if he no longer existed. But Daniel was not a thief. He was not dangerous. He was just unlucky. He was just another man trying to survive. Some days, he found small jobs, cleaning windows, carrying boxes, but most days there was nothing. The hunger in his stomach grew stronger with each passing day. His body became weaker. He had to do something. That is when he decided to do something he never wanted to do. He had to beg for help. He hated the idea of standing on the street and asking for money. But what choice did he have? He swallowed his pride and walked to a diner where people were coming in and out. Maybe, just maybe, someone would show him kindness. He stood outside the door, watching people eat through the window. He could almost taste the warm food. His stomach growled. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. Daniel stood outside the diner, feeling nervous. He had never begged before. He had always worked hard for everything he had. But now, he was out of options. His hands were shaking, his throat dry. He knew he had to do it, even though every part of him felt ashamed. People walked past him, pretending he wasn't there. He tried to speak, but his voice was weak. "Excuse me, sir. Could you spare $1?" He barely got the words out before the man walked away. Another person passed by. "Ma'am, I just need a little help." The woman didn't even look at him. One after another, people ignored him. Some looked disgusted. Others acted like they didn't hear him at all. His heart sank. Maybe no one would help. Maybe no one cared. Then, a man walked towards him. Daniel looked up and saw an older man with silver hair, wearing a simple jacket and jeans. He had a strong face, the kind that looked like it had seen a lot in life. Daniel took a deep breath and tried again. "Sir, could you spare $1?" His voice was soft but desperate. The man stopped. He didn't look annoyed. He didn't walk away. He just stood there, staring at Daniel with piercing eyes. Daniel felt nervous. Had he said something wrong? Was this man going to yell at him, like so many others had? But then, something unexpected happened. The man smiled just a little. It wasn't a big smile, but it was something. It was more kindness than Daniel had seen in a long time. Then, the man spoke. $1? Is that all you want?" Daniel nodded slowly. He wasn't asking for much. Just enough to buy a small meal. Just enough to stop the hunger, even for a little while. The man reached into his pocket. But instead of pulling out $1, he did something that no one expected. The man took his time, reaching into his pocket. Daniel watched, his heart pounding. He hoped for $1. Even a few coins would help. But instead of handing him money, the man did something that left Daniel speechless. The man pulled out his wallet, opened it, and took out a $100 bill. Daniel's eyes widened. He had never seen anyone give that much money to a homeless person before. $100? That could buy him food for days. But before Daniel could say anything, the man smiled and said, "I'll give you this money, but only if you do something for me." Daniel felt confused. What did the man want? Was this a trick? The man continued, "Before I give you this, I want you to sit with me. Let's have a meal together." Daniel's stomach growled. A meal? With this stranger? No one had ever asked to eat with him before. People usually avoided him. They looked at him like he was nothing. But this man was different. Daniel hesitated. He didn't know what to say. But the man just smiled again and gestured toward the diner. "Come on. Let's eat." Something about the way he said it made Daniel trust him. So, for the first time in a long time, Daniel followed someone inside. As they walked in, people stared. A homeless man and a well-dressed man sitting together? It was unusual. But Daniel didn't care. He was about to have a real meal, and for the first time in years, he felt like someone saw him. Like he wasn't invisible anymore. But what happened next was even more unbelievable. Daniel followed the man inside the diner. The warm air wrapped around him, making him realize just how cold he had been outside. The smell of fresh food filled his nose, hot coffee, crispy fries, grilled burgers. His stomach growled loudly, and he felt embarrassed, but the man just chuckled. "Looks like we came to the right place," the man said. People inside the diner turned to look. Their eyes widened when they saw Daniel. Some whispered to each other. Others frowned. A waitress hesitated before coming over. She looked at the well-dressed man, then at Daniel, as if she couldn't believe they were together. Table for two?" she asked uncertainly. The man nodded. "Yes. And bring us 2 plates of whatever's best on the menu." Daniel sat down across from him. The seat felt soft, like a cloud compared to the hard concrete he usually slept on. He felt nervous. He wasn't used to this. He didn't belong here, did he? But the man didn't seem to care about what others thought. He leaned back and smiled. "I never introduced myself," he said. "I'm Clint." Daniel froze. The name sounded familiar. He looked at the man again. The sharp eyes, the deep voice, the confidence. Suddenly, it hit him. This wasn't just any stranger. This was Clint Eastwood, one of the most famous actors and directors in the world. Daniel's heart pounded. Was this really happening? He had seen Clint Eastwood in movies when he still had a TV. He was a legend. What was he doing here? Why was he helping a homeless man like him? Clint must have noticed his shock, because he chuckled. Yeah, I get that look a lot," he said. "But let's not talk about me. I want to know about you." Daniel swallowed. No one had asked about his life in a long time. People usually just assumed things about him. But this man, this Hollywood legend, actually cared. The food arrived, steaming and fresh. Daniel couldn't hold back anymore. He picked up the burger and took a huge bite. The flavors exploded in his mouth. Warm, juicy, delicious. It was the best thing he had eaten in years. Clint watched him with a small smile. "Good." Daniel nodded quickly, his mouth too full to speak. For the next few minutes they just ate. No words. Just food. It felt peaceful. Then Clint spoke again. "So, Daniel, tell me, how did you end up here?" Daniel hesitated. It was a long story. A painful story. But for some reason, he felt like he could tell this man. Maybe because Clint wasn't looking at him with pity. Maybe because, for the first time in years, someone actually wanted to listen. And so, he began to speak. Daniel started slowly. He told Clint about his life before the streets, how he had a job as a mechanic, how he had a small apartment, how he was just like everyone else. But then, things changed. His company started laying off workers. One day, he was called into the office and told that he was no longer needed. Just like that, his job was gone. At first, he thought he would find another job quickly. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. No one was hiring. He applied everywhere. No calls, no interviews, nothing. His savings ran out. Bills piled up. Then, the worst happened. His mother, the only family he had left, got sick. She needed medicine, hospital visits, care. Daniel spent every last dollar trying to help her. But it wasn't enough. She passed away, leaving him completely alone. With no money and no job, he lost his home. The landlord told him to leave. He had nowhere to go. He had no one to turn to. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he quickly wiped them away. He wasn't used to crying in front of people. He had learned to be tough. Clint listened without interrupting. He didn't look shocked or uncomfortable. He just nodded, as if he understood. When Daniel finished, there was a long silence. Then Clint took a deep breath and leaned forward. "You know," he said, "I've met a lot of people in my life. Some had everything handed to them. Others, like you, had to fight for every little thing. And let me tell you something. The strongest people I've ever met were the ones who lost everything but never gave up." Daniel looked down at his hands. "I don't know if I'm strong," he admitted. "I feel like I've already lost." Clint shook his head. "You're still here, aren't you? You're still trying. That's more strength than most people have." Daniel didn't know what to say. No one had ever spoken to him like this. Then, Clint did something unexpected. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the $100 bill again. But this time, he didn't just hand it over. He placed it on the table and looked Daniel straight in the eyes. "This money isn't a handout," Clint said. "It's a second chance. But only if you're willing to take it." Daniel's eyes remained fixed on the $100 bill lying on the table. It wasn't just money, it was something more. A test, a challenge, a second chance. His hands trembled as he reached for it. But then, he hesitated. This wasn't the first time someone had given him money out of pity. Most people tossed him a few coins and walked away without a second glance. But Clint Eastwood. He wasn't just handing over cash. He was offering something different. Daniel looked up at Clint, searching his face for answers. The man's eyes were steady, filled with something Daniel hadn't seen in a long time, belief. Not in himself, but in Daniel. "You don't have to take it," Clint said, his voice calm but firm. "But if you do, promise me one thing. Don't waste it." Daniel swallowed hard. I don't know if I can," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if I fail again?" Clint leaned forward, his expression serious. "You will fail," he said plainly. "More than once. Maybe a dozen times. Maybe 100 times. But that's not what matters. He tapped the table lightly. What matters is that you get back up every single time. Daniel thought about those words. Getting back up. He had spent so many years feeling like he was buried under the weight of his past, trapped in a life he never wanted. But now, for the first time in years, someone was telling him that he wasn't finished. He clenched his fist. Could he really start again? Was it too late? Clint must have sensed his doubt. Let me tell you something, kid, he said. I've seen people rise from nothing. I've seen men who had everything lose it all and still fight their way back. And you know what made the difference? Daniel shook his head. They believed they could. Clint sat back in his chair. You've got two choices right now. You can take that money and waste it, or you can use it to change your life. Daniel's heart pounded. This wasn't just a conversation. This was a turning point. He took a deep breath, reached forward, and picked up the bill. His fingers closed around it tightly, as if holding on to hope itself. I won't waste it, Daniel said, his voice stronger than before. I promise. Clint smiled. That's what I wanted to hear. And with that, everything changed. That night, Daniel didn't sleep under a bridge or in a dirty alleyway. Instead, he found a small motel and paid for a warm bed. It was the first real sleep he'd had in months. The next morning, he used some of the money to buy clean clothes. He looked in the mirror and barely recognized himself. He wasn't just a homeless man anymore. He was someone trying to rebuild. But money wouldn't last forever. He knew that. So, he did something he hadn't done in years. He walked into a shop and asked for work. The manager looked him up and down. You got experience? Yes, Daniel said. I used to be a mechanic. The manager hesitated. We don't need mechanics, but we do need someone to clean up and organize parts. It's not much, but it's something. Something. That was all Daniel needed. I'll take it, he said. And just like that, he had his first real chance. The job wasn't easy. The pay was low. But every day, Daniel worked hard. He arrived early, stayed late, and never complained. The other workers noticed. You're not like most new guys, one of them said. Daniel just smiled. They didn't know where he came from. They didn't know how much this meant to him. 1 month passed. Then 2. Then 3. Daniel saved up enough to rent a small apartment. It wasn't much, just a tiny room with a bed and a chair, but it was his. For the first time in years, Daniel felt like a real person again. And he never forgot the man who had given him that chance. Years later, Daniel stood outside a small auto repair shop. His shop. The sign above the door read, Daniel's Auto Repairs. It had taken him 5 years of working, saving, and never giving up, but he had done it. He had built something of his own. One evening, as he was closing up, a young man knocked on the door. He was wearing torn clothes, his hair messy, his eyes filled with the same hopelessness Daniel once knew too well. Sir, I'm sorry to bother you, the young man said. I need a job. Any job. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. He saw himself in that boy. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a $100 bill, and placed it on the counter. Let me tell you something, Daniel said. This isn't just money. This is a second chance, but only if you're willing to take it. The young man's eyes widened. He hesitated, just like Daniel once had. Do you believe you can start again? Daniel asked. The young man swallowed hard. I don't know. Daniel smiled. Then let's find out. And just like that, the cycle continued. Years had passed, but Daniel never forgot that single moment, the day Clint Eastwood looked him in the eyes and gave him more than just money. He had given him belief, and that belief had turned into something powerful. Daniel wasn't a homeless man anymore. He was a business owner, a mentor, and a man with a purpose. He had built his life from the ground up, not because he got lucky, but because he chose to fight for it every single day. One evening, he sat alone in his small office, looking at an old, worn-out dollar bill he had taped inside a frame. It wasn't the same $100 bill Clint had given him, that was long spent, but it was a reminder of where he came from. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see a woman in her late 30s, nervously holding a piece of paper. Her clothes were old, and her eyes held the same desperation he had once carried. I saw your job posting, she said hesitantly. I don't have much experience, but I'll do anything. Please. Daniel looked at the woman and saw a reflection of himself years ago. What's your name? He asked. Linda, she whispered. Daniel leaned forward, studying her closely. She looked tired, lost, like someone who had been told no too many times. Tell me something, Linda, he said, tapping his desk. Do you believe you can start over? She hesitated, just like he once had. I don't know, she admitted. Daniel smiled. Then let's find out. Without another word, he picked up the framed dollar bill and placed it in front of her. This isn't just money, he told her. It's proof that no one is ever truly lost. As long as you're willing to fight for your future, you can change everything. Tears welled up in Linda's eyes. She reached out, tracing the edges of the glass with trembling fingers. Daniel stood up and held out his hand. You start tomorrow. Linda wasn't just an employee. She became a student. Daniel taught her everything he knew: how to work hard, how to handle customers, how to believe in herself. At first, she struggled. There were days she wanted to quit. Days she felt like she wasn't good enough. But every time she felt like giving up, Daniel reminded her, you don't fail when you fall. You fail when you refuse to get back up. She listened. She learned. And soon, she began to change. Months turned into years. Linda went from cleaning tools to fixing cars. Then she started managing the books. Then she became Daniel's right-hand woman. One day, she walked into his office and placed an envelope on his desk. What's this? Daniel asked. My resignation, she said, smiling. I'm opening my own shop. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. You sure about this? She nodded. Because you made me believe I could. Daniel felt a deep pride in his chest. Years ago, Clint Eastwood had done the same for him. And now, he had done it for Linda. And maybe, just maybe, she would do it for someone else. Because one small act of kindness never truly ends. It continues forever. One afternoon, Daniel was locking up his shop when he heard a voice behind him. I heard about a man who gives second chances. Daniel turned around. A familiar face stood before him. Clint Eastwood. For a moment, Daniel couldn't speak. It had been years. He had dreamed of this moment, but now that it was here, he didn't know what to say. Clint smiled. Looks like you did something good with that $100. Daniel laughed. I tried. They sat outside the shop, just like they had in that diner so many years ago. Why did you do it? Daniel finally asked. Why did you help me? Clint leaned back. Because someone once did it for me. Daniel's eyes widened. He had never thought about that before. Clint Eastwood, one of the most famous men in Hollywood, had once needed a second chance too? I was just a kid, Clint said. Broke, hungry, lost. Someone gave me a job when no one else would. That's why I helped you. And that's why you helped her. Daniel realized something at that moment. The chain of kindness went back further than he had ever imagined. And now it was his turn to keep it going. Clint stood up. Well, I should get going. Daniel hesitated, then reached into his pocket. He pulled out $100 bill and held it out. What's this? Clint asked, raising an eyebrow. Daniel grinned. A second chance. Maybe someone out there needs it more than me. Clint chuckled, took the bill, and nodded. You did good, kid. And with that, he walked away, disappearing into the evening light. But Daniel knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Daniel never imagined how much his life would change because of one small act of kindness. What started as a single moment, one man giving him a chance, had grown into something much bigger than himself. He often thought about how different things could have been if Clint had ignored him that day. What if Clint had walked past him like everyone else? What if he had never received that $100 bill? Would he still be alive? The thought sent shivers down his spine. One choice can change everything. One day, as Daniel walked through his old neighborhood, he saw someone who reminded him of himself, a young man, dirty, exhausted, and sitting on the sidewalk with his head down. He wasn't begging. He wasn't asking for money. He was just lost. Daniel hesitated for a moment, then walked up and sat beside him. You all right? He asked. The young man looked at him, surprised. Why do you care? Daniel smiled. Because someone once cared about me when no one else did. The young man scoffed. I don't need charity. Daniel shook his head. Neither did I. But I needed someone to believe in me. Maybe that's what you need too. The young man didn't respond. He stared at the ground, his hands clenched into fists. Daniel could tell he had been through a lot. What's your name? Daniel asked. Jason. Well, Jason, I'm not here to give you money. I'm here to give you a choice. You can stay here, waiting for life to change, or you can get up and change it yourself. Jason looked up, confused. What do you mean? Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. I own a shop. Come by tomorrow. If you want a second chance, I'll give you one. Jason hesitated. He looked at the card, then back at Daniel. Why would you help me? Daniel smiled. Because someone once helped me. And I believe that if you get the chance, you'll help someone else too. Jason stared at the card for a long time. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. But Daniel knew that deep inside, a seed had been planted. As he walked away, he realized something. This was the true meaning of life. Not money. Not fame. Not success. Helping others. Because one act of kindness doesn't stop with one person, it spreads. And that's how the world changes. This story isn't just about Daniel. It's about all of us. How many times do we walk past people in need? How often do we ignore someone struggling? We all have the power to change lives, but most of us never do. Not because we don't care, but because we don't realize how much one small act can mean to someone. You don't have to be rich. You don't have to be famous. You don't need a lot of money. You just need to care. So if you ever see someone who needs help, don't turn away. Be the person who makes a difference, because kindness doesn't end with one person. It keeps going. And that's how the world becomes a better place.